Maybe people could write in the comments if they can hear us talking. I'll take that as a nose over that.
Live.
You are live. Hi, everyone. We are live. Welcome. I'm Daniel Smith from King's College London. Welcome to you all, and a huge thank you for coming along and keeping up such a strong sense of community through lockdown. I'd also like to take this early moment to thank Rachel Willey and everyone at the Society of Renaissance Studies who makes these brilliant sessions possible. I would think I speak on behalf of us all when I say they've really been a bright light in dark times, and the SRS has really pioneered new ways of running events in our field. So thank you again, Rachel and everyone. It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce our two speakers today, both literary scholars, both book historians, both editors, and both academics of inspirational dedication and integrity, brought together by one extraordinary book, John Milton's copy of Shakespeare. As we're among friends, I hope you'll permit me to go all out and call it the greatest literary discovery of the generation. Yes. So that's why you're all here. Huge numbers. Thank you, everyone. I know we have a huge crowd gathered today, and I don't want to take too much time from the main event. For many of you, our speakers will be extremely well known, but I know we're being joined today by, there's 242 potential attendees, including lots of students. So I do want to introduce our speakers in full and hopefully give you a glimpse of them as human beings, not just a series of scholarly works. After that, our speakers will take turns to talk. Claire's going to speak for about 10 minutes, then Jason for 20, and then Claire for another 10 minutes. My role as a moderator of discussion is rendered pretty minimal, since we're going to ask you to type your questions into the chat, please, or there is a separate question box at the bottom. I'll try and gather them as we go so that speakers can have them all in one place and we don't have to wade through everything manually at the end. At a real life event, of course, the moderator would know when the question session was finished because everyone would be starting to look thirstily at the drinks tray. We can't do that, and instead we hope you'll refresh your glasses throughout. Cheers. So we've decided to say in advance that the question session will be for about 30 minutes so that European listeners can go to bed. And our speakers are going to best judge how to answer those questions, and I'll read out some of those questions to them at the end. Now, one quick technical point. In the top right-hand corner of your screen, there's a word that says options, and to the right of that, there's a sort of square box like that. And if you click on that, that will put your crowdcast into full screen mode, and you'll be able to see the PowerPoints better. All right, so now to our speakers. Both our speakers have long lists of brilliant and influential publications spanning drama, poetry, prose, editing, biography, and book history. I've tried to pick out just a few of their more recent accomplishments to introduce them with. Claire Bourne is Associate Professor of English Literature at Penn State University and one of the world's leading authorities on typography in early modern books. The first thing to say about her is that her magnificent book, Typographies of Performance in Early Modern England, has just been published by OUP. I can quote an early online review now. It's a big, beautiful book, which gets stuck into local interpretive significance and offers some dazzling close readings. It's going to inspire a huge amount of work to come. It's an invaluable resource, a real delight, which absolutely smashes the literary performance false dichotomy, while also being, keyword, fun. So I think you should order yourself a copy immediately. Among her many other publications, I'd like to draw attention to her forthcoming editions of Fletcher and Massinger's Sea Voyage and Shakespeare's Henry VI Part 1 for Arden 4. The important role Claire plays in early modern studies is much more than just a publication, though. Her website, Off Pilcrows, is an outstanding community-minded collection of resources, which is always one of the first places that I direct students to. At the annual Shakespeare Association of America conference, Claire's a leading force in organising a luncheon for early career female scholars, giving dozens of conference attendees an opportunity to meet potential mentors and allies in a positive and supportive environment. When not in the classroom or the archive, Claire teaches group fitness classes, indoor cycling, strength training, and she's publicly vocal about the need for a proper work-life balance and the importance of looking after our physical and mental health in the face of ever-encroaching workloads. I think it's really important to meet the person as well as the academic. So thank you, Claire, for taking that role in the community. Jason Scott Warren is a reader in early modern English literature and culture at Cambridge, where he's also a fellow of Gonville and Caius. Jason's publications are models of how to tie meticulous book historical work to literary and cultural interpretation. He too has just had a book out with the University of Pennsylvania Press, Shakespeare's First Reader, The Paper Trails of Richard Stoneleigh, which has been called learned, wide-ranging, witty, vivid, original, and packed with gems. With Andrew Zerker, he's currently editing the Oxford Handbook of Renaissance Poetry, where, among other things, he's proved extremely patient with at least one very late contributor. Sorry, Jason. Thank you, Jason. Alongside his editorial work on the Oxford Thomas Nash, he's also working towards a very exciting project called The Exuvial Renaissance, about the early modern distributed self. Anyone who knows Jason or follows him on social media will be highly aware of his dedication to fighting climate change and the host of social injustices that come with it. He truly uses his platform to educate, to advocate, and to call out the lies and hypocrisies surrounding this major issue facing humanity. If you're ever looking for an example of scholarly integrity, you should know that the identification of this America-based Shakespeare folio as Milton's came just after Jason publicly pledged to cut out air travel. He has admirably stuck to his word. I'm now going to hand over to Claire and Jason for Rereading Milton, Rereading Shakespeare. Enjoy the talk.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm just going to go ahead and get a PowerPoint up here, and you can let me know in the chat box if this is working. And you can hear me and see the PowerPoint. Just let me know if, okay, great. Thank you. All right. So thank you, Daniel, for that really generous introduction. And thanks also to Rachel and the Society for Renaissance Studies for the invitation to present this work. And then again, thank you to all of you who are tuning in and taking the time to join us from what appears to be all corners of the world. So thanks. All right. So last September, Jason sat down to read an essay of mine published a few months earlier about extensive annotations left by an unnamed 17th century reader in a copy of Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies, i.e. the First Folio, at the Free Library of Philadelphia. The essay was accompanied by many images of these scribal interventions, and his eyes saw something remarkable in those photographs that mine had not been primed to see. A striking resemblance between the handwriting in the blank spaces on the folio's pages and the handwriting of John Milton. The excitement, tinged with some trepidation, is evident in our first exchange via Twitter's direct message function about the possibility that Milton was the reader of the Free Library Folio. Let's call it the start of the would be fun if true phase of the project. Usually such discoveries are quietly and slowly vetted in private and then announced in a publication like the TLS and/or in fully footnoted scholarly articles. But this story unfolded differently. Jason proposed Milton as the reader of the folio in a post on the Cambridge Center for Material Text blog the very same day that he contacted me about his theory. And over the next few days on Twitter and via a flurry of email to and from experts on Milton's handwriting and reading practices, a strong consensus began to form around the attribution. While we will touch on some of the evidence, paleographic and otherwise, that we believe verifies Milton as the reader of this book, the main purpose of our talk today is to unpack what the traces of Milton's readings and indeed rereadings of Shakespeare tell us about his engagement with Shakespeare's language and ideas. We want to make a case for Milton not only reading Shakespeare, as the scribal interventions attest, but also to track how he read the folio by following the instructions from Hemmings and Condell in their prefatory epistle, which invited the reader to read their book and again and again. Milton got caught up in a history of rereading Shakespeare from which we have yet to escape. So our talk today is divided into three parts. I will begin by introducing the book and offering an overview of the variety of reader's marks found on its pages and the reading practices these marks illustrate. I'll also provide dating evidence for these interventions separate from the Milton context in order to establish a rough timeline that actually maps quite well onto the well-studied history of Milton's reading and patterns of annotating. Jason will then delve more deeply into the paleographical conundrums of the volume, and we'll start trying to make sense of the over 600 somewhat reticent brackets that gird passages throughout the book. I'll return at the end to discuss some new tentative findings about the folio's provenance that might also shore up our belief that the book was a part of Milton's personal library. So before I get stuck in, I just want to say that this is a true work in progress. So we do want your feedback. So comments, questions, and leads are more than welcome in the Q&A at the end or beyond that. You should feel free to contact us if you have anything to add. So part 1. Rereading Shakespeare, the book and its markings. I should also say that all of the images of the book I took at the Free Library of Philadelphia, and the Rare Book Department there has very kindly allowed me to use those images in any of our presentations and publications. So I just want to thank the Free Library and the librarians there for all their help. This copy of the 1623 First Folio first entered the historical record at the turn of the 20th century. As a relatively rare perfect copy that is possessing all its leaves in an early binding, its appearance at auction on July 11th, 1899 caused quite a stir. A remarkably beautiful copy, as every leaf from the verses to the last page is in a genuine state as it was originally issued. There are a few manuscript notes, and the prologue to Romeo and Juliet is added in a contemporary hand. Glasgow book collector Bernard Buchanan McGeorge succeeded in purchasing the folio for a record £1,700. The auction itself was full of drama, if bookseller Bernard Carrick is to be believed. Carrick wanted the book so badly that he sent an agent to the sale to bid on it with, quote, the exaggerated commission of £1,200. Once the asking price exceeded a cool $1,000, Carrick's fiery representative entered a bidding war, i.e. carried on the strife, with another agent who Carrick said was holding a simple commission to buy. So this other agent was a Mr. Harvey who was there on behalf of McGeorge. When the bidding reached Carrick's £1,200 limit, his agent, knowing full well that he couldn't afford the book, kept driving up the price by another £500. Clearly bitter about his loss, Carrick asserted that the extra £500 was, quote, a gratuitous addition to the cost of the volume, and estimated that its real value was closer to £1,100. In this account, the exorbitant and unprecedented price of the book was inflated not due to, quote, a great wave of public appreciation for Shakespeare, those are Carrick's words, but rather because, and these are my words, a pissing contest between two agents of the late 19th century book trade. Can you imagine if they'd suspected it was Milton's handwriting inside? Sidney Lee's sense of the book's value upon appraising it for his 1902 census of folio copies was based not only on its status as a perfect copy in an intact early binding, but also on the ambitious literary character of the extensive and varied scribal interventions on its pages. Lee counted some 40 textual emendations in the entire book, concluding that the book had been, quote, studied with close attention and intelligent appreciation. For what it's worth, Lee never speculated about the identity of the reader. We have counted 3 annotations, 122 emendations, 2 substantive additions, and 603, give or take, marginal brackets next to passages that the reader clearly found notable for one reason or another. The brackets are so copious, appearing in all but the Henry VI plays and Titus Andronicus, that the most recent census of First Folios, published by Routledge in 2012, gives up recording instances of the bracketing about halfway through the book. The reader's marks and the book itself offer some clues about when it was read. When Lee insisted, while Lee insisted that it had never suffered any kind of restoration, and later ASW Rosenbach claimed that it existed in its original binding, the book actually acquired its current mottled calfskin binding in the second half of the 17th century, and probably no later than the 1710s or 1720s. This is a boon for us since it establishes an upper limit for when the reader's marks were added, one that certainly accommodates the Milton context. Because marginal emendations and some of the inked brackets around passages of interest were cropped when the book was rebound, they had to have been written before that time. So 3 other notes give us some context for dating. A cross-reference written above Caliban's speech about cursing in The Tempest to Volume 1, page 35 of Samuel Purchas's Pilgrims, published in 1625, provides something of an earlier limit for this particular note. A printed marginal reference to the devil Setebos on page 35 of the first volume of Pilgrims, where Purchas reprints Richard Eden's translation of Magellan's Voyage to the South Pole, attests to Milton's accuracy. Because Milton cites the 1625 edition of Purchas's Pilgrims in the commonplace book that he kept, we know he had access to this copy, to a copy of the book. Another reference to Folio 72 of Surrey's Sonnets, aka Songs and Sonnets, aka, quote, Toddle's Miscellany, next to the Gravedigger's song in Hamlet, corresponds to several editions printed long before the folio. While that tells us that Milton had a copy of Songs and Sonnets to hand, the 16th century imprint of this book doesn't help with narrowing the date of the note. Finally, the stanza of Mariana's song that Milton adds to the last page of Measure for Measure may have been sourced from the 1639 quarto of John Fletcher's The Bloody Brother. However, the transcribed version varies in enough significant ways from the song and the quarto that Milton may have copied it from a contemporary manuscript witness. And we know we have access to several of those today, and there were probably many more circulating at the time. So what we do know is that Milton was reading quarto playbooks around 1640. The textual emendations in the folio offer gripping evidence for a timeline that seems to fit with Milton's travels and readerly travails. They show a reader selectively collating the folio texts of Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet against later quarto editions of these plays, almost certainly the ones published by John Smethwick in 1637. The quartos of Hamlet, and even more so of Romeo and Juliet, that Smethwick put on the market at the end of the 1630s differ from the folio texts and even introduce readings of key passages that diverge from previous quartos. Smethwick announced these changes on the title pages of the new playbooks. Romeo and Juliet was newly corrected, augmented, and amended, while Hamlet was newly imprinted and enlarged according to the true and perfect copy last printed. These claims have often been read as stale, lazy holdovers from previous quarto title pages. But for readers like Milton encountering these playbooks in the late 1630s and 1640s, more than a decade and a half since the last standalone quarters of these plays had come to press, such declarations of textual novelty and improvement carried weight and truth. Indeed, by 1637, Milton was just 1 degree of separation from Smethwick, having contributed a commendatory poem about Shakespeare to the 1632 Second Folio. How and when Milton acquired copies of these quartos is not clear. Just as Smethwick was preparing the new editions, Milton was retiring with his family from the London suburbs to more rural Horton. Aware of Milton's interest in Shakespeare and perhaps understanding Milton to be in a possession of the older 1623 folio, Smethwick may have posted these new quartos hot off the press to the countryside, an invitation possibly for Milton to reread the by then outdated folio against these improved texts. It's also plausible that Milton acquired the playbooks after he returned to London in 1639, following a year-long career-altering trip to Italy, either through Smethwick or by browsing the bookstalls in person. Sidney Lee suggested that the provisional emendations to these playtexts are doubtless due to a native and unaided sagacity. I hope I'm saying that word right. Now that we know Milton, that the reader was Milton, we might be inclined to agree with Lee, except that most of these emendations rely heavily on the 1637 quartos. In the case of Romeo and Juliet, 37 of the 39 emendations correspond to the 1637 quarto, and the 2 that don't correspond were not sourced from any other early text of the play. In the case of Hamlet, 28 of the 32 changes have a basis in Q3 from 1611 and Q4 from 1625, and 27 have a basis in Q5, 1637. But if we know that Milton had Q5 Romeo and Juliet to hand, it's reasonable to think that he purchased Q5 Hamlet at the same time. Milton actually refers to his quarto of Hamlet, inscribing the abbreviated phrase vide supple, i.e. see the supplement or see the supplied, next to a passage in the folio Hamlet that is missing 4 lines, which appear in the same speech as it is printed in the quarto tradition. And in fact, Milton used this phrase in his other books, or a version of this phrase in his other books and his commonplace book to direct attention to supplementary reading materials. This is just a little bit of a preview of some of this paleographic evidence that we've been gathering. Milton uses the quarto text to tinker with meter and correct errors in the folio text of these 2 plays, but in many instances he leans on the quartos to record provisional emendations and lets the corresponding folio reading stand. So while the friar in the folio sees Romeo giving up on his happiness, he is misshaped, i.e. deformed, or maybe mishapped, i.e. unlucky, for giving up on his relationship with Juliet. Milton's collation of this passage opens up the possibility of a Romeo who broods over it. He is misbehaved for pouting upon the situation he's created. The folio gives us a Juliet who anticipates her own sexual pleasure in consummating her marriage. At dusk on her wedding night, she imagines when I shall die, where death is euphemistic for sexual climax. Milton suggests, inspired by Q5, that she might also focus on Romeo's pleasure when he shall die. In F1, Hamlet insults Claudius's impotence, blunt king, in contrast to the quarto reading, in which the prince accuses his uncle of having an insatiable sexual appetite, the bloat king. These suggestions show that Milton was not just rereading the plays in these other versions to note and or extract salient passages for other uses, although the brackets throughout the volume show that he was doing that too. He was also immersing himself in the fictive worlds of the plays to explore the viability of variant readings, something he also does in his engagements with continental and classical literature. The resulting interventions illustrate a careful attention to wordcraft, as well as illuminating, but not necessarily resolving, the interpretive potential of key passages. The folio, despite its prefatory insistence on its own textual authority, was crucially not the last word on the Shakespearean text. So it seems clear that Milton used the quartos as instruments of rereading, making circa 1637 a crucial moment in the timeline of his reading and rereading of Shakespeare. So as Jason will discuss now, this dating may fit with Milton's itineraries in the late 1630s and early 1640s, both as a reader, but also as a traveler.
Okay, thank you, Claire. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm going to try to access my PowerPoint. The fear that I have is I'm going to lose access to the chat, which is so wonderful. I've really been enjoying the chat, but maybe a price I have to pay. And I urge you all, if you haven't made your screens full screen, if you haven't toggled full screen, you may want to experiment with that because I'm going to be talking about a few details here. So I'm hoping you may be able to see my my PowerPoint now. If someone could, yes, good, okay. You can see my PowerPoint, fine. So I am going to get a bit stuck in a bit more deeply for my sins to the paleography, and specifically to what it can tell us about the chronology and I can see the chat, yay, the chat is always here. The question of when exactly these notes might have been written. So Milton's handwriting is famously problematic, and much ink has been spilt on the subject since, and I have to see if I can change my PowerPoint slide. Can I change my slide? Since, yeah, here we go. The publication in 1861 of Samuel Lee Sotheby's endlessly digressive ramblings in the elucidation of the autograph of Milton. Since that pioneering contribution, generations of scholars have trained their magnifying glasses on the pages of the Trinity manuscript and the commonplace book, attempting to track the subtle and not so subtle shifts that might allow us to date entries to particular moments in the 1630s and 1640s, and so to trace the chronology of Milton's reading and writing. The most durable observations about Milton's handwriting have been in the not so subtle category, relating to two big changes that Milton seems to have made quite deliberately around the time of his journey to Italy in 1638 to 9. The first is the shift from Greek or epsilon E to italic E, which you can see taking place in the revisions to Lycidas and Comus in the Trinity manuscript. So here, you can see what could the muse herself at Orpheus Bourne. You can see in herself, you've got a sudden sort of outbreak of modern form minuscule E, but in Orpheus and Bourne, you've got the old epsilon E, and so I don't think this is the birth of Selford, but it's somehow the birth of this transition to an italic E. The second shift, which relates specifically to the marking of emendations in books from Milton's library, is a shift from the asterisk to the cross. And while the precise dating of this shift is not known, it seems to have been complete by 1638. While these two shifts may not have coincided, there's a strong correlation between asterisks and epsilon E's and between crosses and italic E's in Milton's annotations. And you can see that here. These are two annotations from his Euripides. And on the left, you've got the asterisks and the epsilons, and on the right you've got the stars and the italics. When we turn to the Milton Folio of Shakespeare, two things are immediately striking. The first is that the italic E's are very much in the ascendant. So this is my attempt to map his E's onto the pages of the Hinman facsimile of the folio. And you can see that, in fact, only 2 pages, I think, only very, very few of his interventions, I think 2 interventions, in fact, use the the epsilon E form, the earlier form. The second is that the stars slightly steal a mark on the asterisks. So stars appear in 5 plays, asterisks appear in 3, and 1 play contains both. And that little chart on the right shows you how he's keying the different emendations. And so that allows us to ascribe some plays, some readings that he's doing to a date before or after the Italian trip of 1638 to 9. So just in the corner of the screen there, you can see Midsummer Night's Dream, Coriolanus, Timon, and Macbeth all being read seemingly before that watershed, Tempest, Measure for Measure, Troilus, Romeo and Juliet, maybe Macbeth again, Hamlet and Lear afterwards. If the evidence for this table feels maybe slightly flimsy, I mean, I feel slightly scared worrying about relying on this these tiny details, it nonetheless begins to suggest something important, which is that Milton's engagement with the Free Library Folio may have taken place over a period of some years. And in this, it resembles his dealings with other books that he owned, such as the 2-volume edition of Euripides in the Bodleian and the Aratus Phenomena now at the British Library. And both of those books span the divide. Both of them have both kinds of annotation. Milton's folio is unlike any of his other surviving books, though, in containing one conspicuously early entry, also the most conspicuous outbreak of epsilon E in the volume, in the shape of the prologue to Romeo and Juliet, transcribed from a quarto edition because it was missing in the folio. Milton elsewhere in this folio shows himself to be a big fan of Shakespeare's choruses, and Henry V, he marks all the choruses, and he clearly felt the absence of this baleful prologue. So he transcribed the whole thing. And given how much manuscript material survives of Milton's from the 1630s and 1640s, it's really remarkable how little survives from before that time. I've been trying to get my head around this. There seems to be barely anything. So what we have is a 1629 document known as the Supplicat, which is when he's supplicating for his Cambridge degree, and he has to write a little inscription there. And there's also a document which kind of fell out of the commonplace book, which is called The Theme on Early Rising. This is now at the University of Texas at Austin, the Harry Ransom, and these verses, this theme, this prose theme, and associated verses on early rising may date back to Milton's school days, but both Peter Beale and Will Poor have really serious doubts about whether whether it's him, far more inclined, I think, to suspect that it's a student of Milton's, maybe in the 1630s or 40s, doing this exercise. So in the Romeo and Juliet prologue, if we accept that it's in his hand, we have a very substantial new example of Milton's script in an earlier and unfamiliar phase of its development. Although the nib of the pen is thicker, and the ink is a lighter shade of brown, the hand is similar in many respects to that of the 1629 Supplicat, mixing straight and curved ascenders on the P's and the T's. I think those are my blue arrows and my green arrows, supplying a notional, often incomplete ligature for ST, those are my orange arrows, and intermittently using a noticeably enlarged long S, which are my red arrows. Is that right? Yeah, I think so. Milton also imposes a number of his favoured spellings on this text, including THIRE for there. 6 times he uses that spelling, and TOW for two, which he uses 3 times. I've only given you a bit of the text here, obviously. And these are the standard spellings of the word in the Trinity manuscript. It's hard to date writing that is so obviously on its best behaviour, but the similarity between this and the Supplicat makes it tempting to put it in the mid-late 1620s. We can also see that apart from a couple of points where the spelling fits the prologue as it's offered in Q5 Romeo and Juliet in 1637, the one Claire's mentioned, which he's probably copying in all his emendations from. The orthography and punctuation here mostly follows the text as it was printed in Q2 to Q4, the quartos published between 1599 and 1622, strongly suggesting that Milton's following an earlier printing here. Finally, we should notice the appearance of this brace in the left-hand margin of the prologue, which is very like the braces that appear throughout the volume. Partly because it isn't on its best behaviour, it's a bit of a mess, and thus it seems to represent a later Milton happening upon this intervention by an earlier one, kind of thinking, oh yeah, I love this prologue, and that was why I copied it down. Again, this suggests a gap of some years between the annotation, between this annotation and the bulk of the annotations in the volume. And if we want, we can slip still further into this rabbit hole into the past. As Claire suggested in her initial survey of the folio, Milton's rechristening of the play as Juliet and Romeo, you can see the heading that he gives the prologue there, the prologue to Juliet and Romeo, may be influenced by the final lines of the play, for never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo. And if that's so, then the earliest sign of his reading in the book is pointing us to still earlier readings. Meanwhile, the rest of the annotations in Romeo and Juliet are, of course, in my much later category. They were made after the publication of the 1637 quarto, and they're full of stars and full of italic E's. So here we have a Milton who has really swallowed Heming and Condell's injunction in the First Folio's prefatory letter to read him, therefore, and again and again. And that fits maybe with a broader suspicion that, while this may be the First Folio, it is probably not showing us Milton's first reading of Shakespeare. Milton's first published poem was the Epitaph on Shakespeare, an epitaph that testifies to the wonder and astonishment that Shakespeare inspires in his readers, who encounter his Delphic lines in the leaves of his unvalued book. From the leaves of my unvalued book, a very relevant quotation today. This epitaph was written in 1630 and published anonymously in the Second Folio in 1632. And that means it's possible that this epitaph precedes all of the marginalia in the Free Library Folio, save for the Romeo and Juliet preface. So Milton had already been knocked flat by Shakespeare by 1630. Astonished, turned to stone by Shakespeare. And it's possible that it's likely, in fact, that Milton's association with Shakespeare, acquaintance with Shakespeare, begins still earlier than that, since we now know that his father was a trustee of the Blackfriars Theatre in 1620 and was himself a poet who may have been, as Gordon Campbell has suggested, the IM who contributed a prefatory poem to the First Folio in 1623. Although I don't think Milton adds a note to this saying, this is my dad, so I don't know what we're going to make of that. So much for the Romeo and Juliet prologue, the earliest entry in the book. Working out how late the annotations might go is difficult too, although they must, of course, date from before Milton went completely blind in 1652. The paleographical evidence doesn't help us a lot here, since following the Italy trip of 1638-9, Miltonists tend to speak of a 1640s hand, and they tend not to discriminate subtle shades of it. Still, while I haven't found a perfect match for this rather beautiful feathery hand with which Milton pens the second verse of "Take, oh, take those lips away," it seems to me to be a fairly close relative of some of the later entries in the Commonplace book, in particular those that record extracts from chronicle histories, such as Holinshed's entries probably dating from 1639 to 41, when Milton was collecting plans for dramas based on English history and gathering materials for his pamphlet of Reformation. We might also set the cross-reference to Purchas's travel narratives in The Tempest, alongside the two citations from Purchas in the Commonplace book, both dated by Will Poole to the early mid-1640s, which consolidates our sense that maybe 1639 to 45 is a rough date for these later annotations. But one strange consequence of this is that the echoes of Milton's own verses in the passages that he marks in the folio suddenly appear to be more retrospective than prospective. In an earlier paper, for example, we drew attention to the obvious connections between Ariel's invisible dawn song, "Come unto these yellow sands," and the Ode on the Morning of Christ's Nativity, very significant poem in Milton's development. So you can see, curtsied when you have and kissed the wild waves whist, and then the winds with wonder whist smoothly the waters kissed. And there are lots of connections between The Tempest and that poem. But the ode was composed in 1629, while the notes were probably written 10 to 15 years later. Of course, one could argue that Milton is still inhabiting his youthful poems, which remain unpublished until 1645 and may have been revised over time. Still, the notes in the folio seem to look backwards rather than forwards, echoing a version of Shakespeare that Milton has been constructing for some time. The manner in which the Free Library Folio is marked, I think, also tells of rereading, the 600 marginal brackets on top of all that local emendation, since it recalls the practice that he seems to have employed in the volumes he excerted in his Commonplace book, which he began compiling in the mid-1630s. Although the books that he drew on for his commonplacing have not been found, where is Milton's library? His note-taking style can, as Poole notes in his new edition, be inferred from the entries. It was Milton's habit to crunch through vast folio volumes and church histories, marking passages that, vast folio chronicles and church histories, marking passages that interested him. And only at the end of that process did he then go back through the volume and enter the material under topical headings. We can be sure, writes Poole, that his notes signal a review of reading and not the initial reading itself. The folio, with its 600-odd marginal brackets, looks as if it might be waiting for someone to breeze through and scoop up all the markings, though there's no reference to Shakespeare anywhere in the Commonplace book. Sidney and Chaucer make brief appearances. This may not be surprising, since the Commonplace book is quite particular in its remit. It exists to mop up ethics and economics and politics, not that Shakespeare is entirely silent on those subjects. But what would a missing Commonplace book designed to capture the materials that Milton singles out in Shakespeare look like? I recently went through the folio and tried rather quixotically to put all the entries under headings. Sorry, this is the index to the Commonplace book for those of you who aren't familiar with it. So ethical, economic, and political columns, and then lots of subheadings under that of the different subjects that the Commonplace book treats. And then my attempt to make up the headings for the missing Commonplace book, which has been quite bizarre. And you can see that I have a big category called why, when you just can't work out why exactly Milton's marked a particular passage. I'll leave you to absorb that for a moment. So the trouble with this exercise, as I rapidly discovered, was that most of Milton's bracketed passages could fit under several headings. So to put them into just one felt like an act of violent simplification. Still, the act of making this lost Commonplace book, ridiculous though it was, did draw attention to a few salient features of Milton's markings, which I want to elaborate on a little bit here. Sedge, yeah, there's a lot of sedge. So So the first point that I want to make is that the density of annotation varies wildly between plays. Although there is an extraordinary amount of annotation, it's not at all evenly dispersed. And Claire has made this beautiful graph, which I hope you can see. So from left to right, you have the starting at the Tempest on the left and running through to Cymbeline on the right, and you can see the level of annotation. So the orange lines are for bracketed passages, the blue are for emendation. So you can see Romeo and Juliet on the right hand side, and Hamlet are the two massively amended texts. So many plays are hardly touched. So Two Gentlemen, Comedy of Errors, Much Ado, Midsummer Night's Dream, Taming, King John, Richard III, Timon of Athens, all receive paltry numbers of interventions, the odd scattered mark here or there. Other plays get sporadic, intermittent noticings: Love's Labour's Lost, Merchant of Venice, All's Well, Richard II, Troilus, Coriolanus, Julius Caesar. And then there are plays that receive patchy kinds of attention. So Henry IV, 1 and 2, and Measure for Measure pass by with almost no noting of comic scenes, while The Winter's Tale has no marks at all in the first half, and then sudden flurry around Antigonus's speech, ending in the pursuit by a bear, Times, chorus, and the pastoral scenes of Act 4. Along with that play, As You Like It and Cymbeline, both generously marked, perhaps tell of Milton's love of pastoral. His pen seems suddenly to spring to life in the open air. And then there are a few plays where the reading seems genuinely immersed, above all The Tempest and the tragedies on the right-hand side of the graph. You can see they're sort of up and off the scale. So there are plays, these are plays where we start to see Milton employing horizontal or diagonal strokes that appear to substitute for his local markings, as if to say, this is all absolutely great. So you can see there, just at the top on the right-hand side, this kind of sort of Shazam mark, and that seems to mark out a column or a scene, which he just thinks, I infer he thinks is not worth marking in its small details because it's all of a piece. Great. Were we taking all this to be reading rather than reading, there would be some real surprises here. So Midsummer Night's Dream has often been thought to be a major influence on Milton. In his attempt to reconstruct Milton's library back in 1975, Jackson Boswell reckoned that Richard III was the only Shakespeare play that Milton must have owned. And they're hardly annotated here. And if these are rereadings, though, I think that patchy annotation may not indicate lack of interest. The second point I want to dwell on, just to close my part of this talk, is Milton's mode of attack. And this also has to do with dating and when exactly we think this fits in Milton's career, because obviously these, itsy-bitsy distinctions between is it 1637 or is it 1640, these have a very major impact on our sense of where these readings are in Milton's career. So it would be easy for us to imagine Milton, the emerging radical, engaging quite energetically and politically with the unfolding narratives of the plays. And here I want to bounce off an article published in 2011 by Nicholas McDowell entitled Milton's Regicide Tracts and the Uses of Shakespeare. Not to critique the article in any way, but just because it kind of helps me to kind of get at something about the notes in this book. So in that article, McDowell tries to work out what Shakespeare meant to Milton in 1649 and 1650 as he defended the execution of Charles I and tried to quell the influence of the posthumous bestseller Icon Basilicae, which transmitted the pathos of the martyred king to a pan-European readership. McDowell notes passages in Richard III, Julius Caesar, Macbeth, and The Tempest that seem to feed Milton's political thinking at this extraordinary historical juncture. And it's quite striking that the relevant passages all go unmarked in the Free Library Folio. He sometimes marks passages very close by, but he doesn't actually mark the specific points that McDowell is working with. There's no difficulty there, of course, since the folio is a kind of partial snapshot, we think, of Milton's reading. But what I want to draw out here is something about the style of that reading. So for McDowell, Macbeth serves Milton as a resource for thinking about the relationship between monarchy and tyranny. In urging the English people to get behind the regicide, Milton places himself in a position uncomfortably akin to that of Lady Macbeth telling her husband to man up. On another occasion, as he contemplates writing his own Macbeth play here in the Trinity manuscript, Milton seems to envisage the usurper as a tyrant whose reign of terror will demand resistance. And still elsewhere, Milton seems to cast the backsliding Presbyterians, those hate figures of the mid-late 1640s, as akin to Macbeth's equivocating witches, juggling and paltering, rather than getting behind the radical cause. These are very different readings, but they're all using the Macbeth story as a resource for political reflection. Now I want to look at the way that the free library Milton moves across the surface of the play. And the first and most obvious thing to say is that he's absolutely obsessed with witchcraft. So here I've given you a few of the witchcraft scenes and the marks that he makes on them. Every witch scene is marked in this folio, even those that were probably written or doctored by Middleton. Unless we think that this is a sign of terrible, indiscriminate judgment, he does highlight a few delicious details of these scenes, including Banquo's, if you can look into the seeds of time and say which grain will grow and which will not, and his the earth has bubbles as the water has, and these are of them. So witches he loves. Next, we might note a penchant for horror, taking in Lady Macbeth's "Unsex me here" speech, Macbeth's Now or the One Half World, where he works himself up to the murder of Duncan with allusions to witchcraft, murder and rape, and several nasty moments from the scene with Banquo's ghost. The times has been that when the brains were out, the man would die, and that stuff. Also marked are the play's numerous portents, including the shrieking of owls and the crying of crickets at the moment of the murder, and the conversation between the old man and Ross about the confusion of night and day. Most of them are, and when you've got those two headings, when you've got the kind of the witchy and the horrific and the portentous, you have wrapped up the majority of the annotations to Macbeth, strangely. But then there are other annotations which are more piecemeal and harder to categorize. So I just want to take you very quickly through those. So on the first page, there's a mark for Lennox's statement about the Thane of Ross. What a haste looks through his eyes, maybe speaking to an interest which he shows elsewhere in the reading of appearances. Another accompanies Ross's description of how he's come from Fife, where the Norwegian banners flout the sky. You can see there's a little correction there, flout. He's put in the T. And fan our people cold. I think he's put in the T. This is an epic hyperbole. Maybe it's looking forward to the grand style of Paradise Lost. Sublimity may also justify the marking of pity like a naked newborn babe striding the blast, if you need any justification for that marking. There are three marks by the dialogue between Ross and Malcolm, as the former prepares to tell the latter that his wife and children have been murdered, a high pitch of the tragedy. Perhaps the kind of thing that would have sparked off Euripidean or Senecan echoes in Milton's mind. And then there's a curious correction in Macbeth's conversation with the doctor in Act 5, Scene 3, where Macbeth demands a cure for the nation, asking what rhubarb, cyme, or what purgative drug would scour these English hence. And Milton corrects cyme to senny, a variant of senna, a well-known purgative, apparently still a well-known purgative. He'll be just as interested later in the poison that was used to kill old Hamlet. And throughout, he's kind of very aware and interested in drugs and medicines and references to poison. Here in the Senny reference, you'll notice that we've got an asterisk and we've got a couple of epsilon e's. These are the other epsilons in the book. Thank you very much, Diane. So Milton this is a sign that he's reading Macbeth early on. He's reading Macbeth long before his radicalization, so maybe it's not surprising that his reading is less political. The play actually mixes asterisks and stars. There's a star for the temple haunting Barlet, which is corrected to Marlet, House Martin or a Swift, I think. The temple haunting Martlet is corrected with a star. So he's actually reading before and after 1638. But as well as being apolitical, Milton's reading is also not specially trained, I don't think, on the plot, on the machinations of the usurper, or on the unravelings of the witches' palterings. One exception to that, which is when he says, infected be the air whereon they ride, the witches, and damned all those that trust them, where he does seem to, that's an annotation which seems to sort of glance at the shape of the plot as we have it, but that's a real exception to the rule. And when he gets to the end of the play and he marks, I have lived long enough, catching some of the pathos of Macbeth's predicament. He also marks something purely adventitious, the attack on a messenger as a cream-faced loon with a goose look. You can see just above that. He's fond of Shakespeare's insults. So even in a play where Milton is clearly immersed, his annotations seem to me to speak not to plot or to politics, but to atmosphere, to striking turns of phrase, to intermittent flashes of brilliance and sublimity. While all kinds of interests clearly play across Milton's markings in this book, and I hope I've given you a taste of some of those, the overriding interest seems to be in Shakespeare as a technician of language, a writer worth attending to, first and foremost, for the local brilliance of his writing. And I'm going to hand back to Claire for the last section.
All right.
Yeah, that's good.
All right, so part 3 of this talk is about the provenance of this book, about which I didn't know very much beyond the 1899 catalog. I couldn't get very far when I initially did the research on this book, but we've managed to make a little bit of headway, and that's what I want to present to you today with the caveat that this is highly speculative. So what happened to the folio after it left Milton's hands? Somewhat unusually, the fly leaves bear no evidence of his movements or ownership between when it was rebound and when it surfaced in 1899. There we go. What we do know is that the folio was lot 309 in an auction that took place on Tuesday, July 11th, 1899 at the Christie's sale rooms in London. It was one of 37 books in a consignment brought to Christie's by an unnamed seller. The entire consignment is listed under the heading Another Property, following lists of items for sale from 2 other named consignments. Shortly after the sale, Sidney Lee reported that the book, quote, was brought thither by a native of Belgium, who stated that it had been in his possession of his family for more than a century. Lee then suggested, on what grounds we don't really know, that the book had been in the Belgian family's possession for more than 2 centuries. In his 1902 census entry for the copy, Lee was a bit more specific, noting that the book had been, quote, long in the French family of Belroche, which settled for a time in England after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, and was, quote, subsequently owned by a member of the family residing near Brussels. He offers no evidence for the claim that the Belroche family fled to England in 1685. So, Lenore Corral's catalog of 19th century book auction catalogs offers one more enticing detail by recording a first initial. An F. Belroche was the seller behind the consignment. Why we don't have the full name, I don't know. So I'm going to show you a little bit of a family tree, a very basic family tree here. A Frederick Auguste Belroche was born in the Flemish port city of Ostend in 1798. He descended from a branch of the Belroche family that dispersed to Germany, specifically to Stuttgart, after the Edict of Nantes was revoked in 1685. By the middle of the 19th century, Frederick Auguste was active in trade and communications across the English Channel. Frederick Auguste is probably not the F. Belroche behind the unnamed 1899 consignment. He would have been 101 years old in 1899, and circumstantial evidence suggests that he died before 1890. But he may have been the book's erstwhile owner. Based on a lot of fiddly genealogical research into the Belroche family, we think that the person who seems most likely to have brought the First Folio and those 37 other books to Christie's is Frederick Auguste's son, Frederick Willem, then 70 years old. So I'm not saying this was the person who sold the folio. I'm saying this is the closest we've gotten to identifying an F. Belroche in the right time period. So that's where we are right now. So Lee probably assumed that the family acquired the book in England because he assumed that this branch of the family fled to England. Indeed, the timing of this assumption works quite nicely with some of the other facts. Milton's library had been slowly dispersed in the years leading up to his death in 1674, and it's not too difficult to imagine the folio finding its way into the secondhand book trade, where it could have been bought and rebound after 1685. So an alternative to Lee's narrative, and a highly speculative one, is that it was the family's involvement in trade with England, the Bulrush's family's involvement in trade with England, that brought the book to the continent through marriage. And these are the red names that I've highlighted here on the genealogy. The relevant branch of the Protestant Belroche family initially fled to Stuttgart, not England, in the late 17th century, before a shoot of that branch established itself in coastal Ostend by the late 18th century. The 1788 marriage of Frederick August's Stuttgart-born father to Catherine Byne, a native of Hull, offers a tantalizing new avenue of provenance inquiry and works well with the F. Belroche telling Lee that the book had been in his family for more than a century. That would have put, if it came through Catherine Byne, it would have been in the family for 111 years. But you see, as it turns out, the Byne family, that is the English family that married into the Belroche family, was connected through marriage, probably sometime in the early 1730s, to the family of Elizabeth Minchell. Milton should know that name, because she married Milton in 1663 and became practically and famously his sole inheritor. So a different Elizabeth Minchell married a John Scott in 1707, and their daughter Margaret married Stephen Byne sometime before 1739. So, all right, just bear with me here. The question is whether Milton's copy of the folio was sold off before or around the time of his death in 1674, or whether it remained in Elizabeth Minchell's possession until her death in 1727. It's obvious, we know Milton had access to a large number of books, and it's generally accepted that he amassed a substantial personal library, but he never made an inventory of his personal collection, and if he did, it doesn't survive. Until now, only 8 books have been positively identified as having passed through his hands, and the folio would make 9. Many of his books were sold off before he died, and after his death in 1674, book dealers picked over the remains of his library for volumes to sell in the secondhand trade. There's even a story recorded in the testimony at the probate of Milton's will that his daughters conspired to steal his books and, quote, sell the rest of them to the dunghill women. So something just happened with my PowerPoint there. Okay. All right. The story is most likely apocryphal, but we do know that the Shakespeare folio did not end up on any literal shit pile that Milton's daughters are said to have envisioned, if not intended, as a place to dispose of his books. The remains of the poet's personal collection ended up dispersed, except for a small consignment of books that apparently remained with his third wife, Elizabeth, née Minchell, until she died. So what you see here, among the goods and chattels that belonged to her at the time of her death were a large Bible, 2 books of Paradise, some old books and a few pictures, and Mr. Milton's pictures and coat of arms. So while Milton's copy of the 1623 folio may have found its way into the marketplace for secondhand books when he died, it's also plausible that it ended up among the old books that Elizabeth kept in her possession and bequeathed to her nieces and nephews, along with her other goods upon her death. And so it's through those nieces and nephews that we're trying to find this connection. The question on our plate now is whether the folio could have passed from Elizabeth Milton through the Minchells to the Bynes to the Belroches. We're still trying to figure out if there's a point of contact, and if so, where it is. Tracking the book's provenance right back to Milton himself is perhaps wishful thinking. But then again, much of the wishful thinking surrounding this book seems to have been fulfilled. So to quote Jason from Twitter back in September 2019, it would be fun if true. Thanks so much.
Thank you for that absolutely brilliant pair of talks. Just staggering amount of information, detail, elegance of presentation. Everyone at home is clapping, or you can see them writing clap, for example, which is the new way of clapping. There we go.
Big clap to the audience as well for the chat has been absolutely amazing.
Okay, I've never seen so many comments come in quite so quickly. So I think let's revel in the applause. Thank you so much again. I've been starting to gather some questions. I want to ask people, if you do have questions, now is the time. Put them in the chat. There's a separate ask a question box. I've just seen a new one being posted. So what I'll do is I'll ask you some of the ones that I've gathered together so far. And then as you're speaking, I will look slightly distracted because I'll be copying and pasting some more.
This is also when people should go and get some warm white wine for themselves.
Warm white wine, absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, I just wanted to start with a couple of general comments, not questions, but good ones. And it was a really early comment by Zachary Lasser struck me. He said, the story behind the story is such a model of scholarly integrity and collaboration. And I know everyone here thinks that. So we also want to give you really full credit for that. And maybe we could hear a bit more about that later, but I want to stick to the specific questions. Zach Lesser also said that the library itself is under a funding threat. You can write to the Mayor of Philadelphia and to the City Council of Philadelphia. And there is information about that in the chat if you wanted to do that. Diane Mitchell posted in some contact details.
Yeah, please do so.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there was someone wrote a really wonderful summary, which was Tara Lyons. This talk has it all: provenance, graphs of annotation, collating ease, smart readings of Milton readings, and dunghill women. So on behalf of everyone, thank you for that.
Well, it went from a pissing contest to a dunghill women.
From a pissing contest.
Got to keep it interesting.
Okay, I'm going to start with a question from Sharon Atchenstein. So amazing. The manuscript hand is totally convincing. What helps us see that those brackets are Milton's own and not some later owner? I love the idea that those are his, and it's so convincing, but I just want a little more on explaining the finding, kind of talking through your rationale for that.
Yeah. I mean, Claire, you should go first, except I just wanted to say that I think one thing that I was thinking about this because I got asked this in a previous question session, and the one thing that was making me very confident was witches, because of the Setebos kind of interest and the plethora of witchiness in The Tempest and Macbeth. Sorry, but Claire, do you want to take it?
I mean, strictly from a sort of material textual standpoint, in terms of dating those, we know that they were there at the time the folio was rebound, right? So just like some of the annotations are cropped, many of those kind of horizontal score marks that Jason was showing were also cropped. Obviously, that doesn't mean that the same person, cheers. It doesn't mean that the same person put them there, but they were probably, there's at least an endpoint for both of those kinds of interventions. It seems like a lot of the brackets were put in later. Jason pointed out the bracket around the prologue, but also there are a couple of instances where there's a provisional emendation in the margin, but and the person is kind of like on whoops around it with these kind of wonky brackets. So it's clear in terms of chronology, at least in some moments, I don't want to generalize, but in some moments that the brackets have been like a later rereading. So that doesn't answer the question of how we know whether they're definitely Milton's or not. I mean, I suppose we could do some ink analysis at some point, see if that would work. Yeah, I mean, we're sort of working under the assumption that they are, but it's good to be kind of skeptical about that, given that they seem to be the most belated of the interventions.
Great, thank you. Did you want to carry on,
Just
Jason?
to say, well, Claire told me to arm myself with some spare images for tough questions. So I thought if I can share my PowerPoint again, which I may not be able to do. Oh, maybe, is it not? Has that worked? Has that worked?
Yeah.
Is it there? Okay, so I think what you can see now is the Euripides. And you can see that kind of brace there, which is on a passage, I think, about the joys of not living in a monarchy turning into a tyranny, but instead of living in some kind of commonweal. That's the kind of mark you get a few times in the Euripides, which I haven't actually seen firsthand, but that kind of mark does exist. Another, if I can find it, yeah. I mean, so this is the one which is most like the folio in terms of its markings, is the Heraclides at Illinois, where you get a lot of marginal braces. So you can see those on the left, 4 examples. And sometimes I was annoyed. I had an example which was more like where there was some text as well, and you could sort of see what was going on there. And then the folio on the right. it's not. It's kind of interesting. His style does seem to vary from book to book, and I think that the folio is less. I'm just going to get out of screen sharing now. The folio is sort of somehow is different in the way that it does these braces, because they tend to sort of billow out. In past talks, I've talked about them as being like clouds, and they don't billow out in any other source. I don't know. Am I stopping screen sharing? Close video. Close video. Yeah. So they in the folio you get these sort of clouds of braces, which you don't get in others of his books that we know about. But there are nonetheless, there is a similarity of practice across different books. I don't know if that helps.
The comment that followed that up was sold. So that's seen as a convincing answer.
Excellent.
And then I do have another question, but Hannah Crawford just added here, elsewhere in Euripides, you can see his pen tearing the page and the marking is getting more wobbly, presumably as his eyesight fails. He certainly reread that volume in the way you describe his encounter with the Shakespeare folio here.
Okay, so interesting.
Really
yeah,
interesting.
I need to see that book. Yeah.
Okay, so I have a question from Emma Atwood, and then someone had a follow-up question. Stephen Fallon had a follow-up question. So Emma asks, I'm wondering if you have a take on what these marginal interventions were ultimately after. Is Milton correcting moments in the folio with moments that he prefers from other quarto versions? Is he offering multiple possibilities to add complexity? Are there obvious moments that don't match up between folio and quartos that he doesn't correct, amend? And if so, why might he choose certain moments? So I'll ask you that one, then I'll ask a follow-up question.
Yeah, so first of all, there are plenty of variants between the folio text of these two plays and the quarto text that he doesn't note or mark at all. And I did a count of those at one point, and I've been trying to find my file with that number, and I have not been able to find it, but I will, or I'll go back and recollate and figure it out again, as is my wont. But I think the more we study these interventions and annotations, the more I'm convinced that he's not correcting Shakespeare. I think he's playing with meter. He does correct some typographical error, but he's like playing with meter and trying to, like, when there's an hypermetrical line, he's trying to get it back into iambic pentameter, for example, and it doesn't seem like correcting. It seems like he's really interested in like the technicalities of Shakespeare's writing. And Shakespeare as the phrase, I think, Jason, you used this phrase, or we've been talking about this phrase, but kind of like a technician of language. One of the kinds of interventions that we didn't note today in The Tempest, which must be when he starts reading, he's underlining double-barreled adjectives a lot. And a lot of the passages that he actually marks in Macbeth, because that's the play we've looked at most closely because of Jason's work on it, seem to have these kind of like double-barreled adjectives or like really inventive modifiers and descriptors. So I think there's a kind of curiosity to the way that he engages with Shakespeare. And I think that's one reason why he makes what I've been calling provisional emendations. He doesn't cross out the folio and say, this is wrong. He says, like, here's an alternative, and that actually changes the way we read character, or maybe this language is more interesting. I mean, the blunt king versus the bloat king, those are two very different things. When Hamlet says that to his mom, right? Is your husband's impotent or he's oversexed? Like, those are totally different things. So I think he's exploring the fictive worlds of the plays, but what language, localized language, can do. So I hope that kind of, Emma, I hope that kind of gets at your question. So yeah. Jason.
Well, Hannah's also saying that, Hannah Crawford saying that he does similar things in the Euripides. I think a lot of the Greek, so I think about 4 Greek books surviving, and he does a lot of kind of noting alternative readings there. And actually also the other thing, there's a paper which I heard sort of by chance, because I happened to be at this online conference back in March, by Tom Fulton about the family Bible, Milton's Bible in the British Library, which is sort of, it's now so sort of fallen to pieces and so fragmentary that they won't let you see it. Or they haven't. I mean, they won't. maybe they'll let you see it if you've got sufficient credentials. I don't know. But he had this paper which was about Milton's Psalm translations, Psalm paraphrases, and he And he did some really interesting work with the way that Milton is using alternate readings in the text of the Bible, so that the way that the Bible is marking alternate readings from the Hebrew. And just kind of talking about the way that Milton is like obviously sort of somehow fired up by the whole kind of business of the alternate reading. So yeah, I think that's really important. I noted down before I came a few of these things in The Tempest. So he underlines still vexed in the still vexed Bermuths. He does very few underlining, so these are really striking in The Tempest. He underlines sight outrunning, Jove's lightning more momentary and sight outrunning were not. He underlines the blue-eyed and blue-eyed hag. He underlines the never surfeited in never surfeited sea. And he also underlines, I really like this, he underlines watchdogs, and then the watchdogs bark. I think that slide I showed. And I thought, well, why on earth? I mean, like, watchdogs is not a piece of literary linguistic creativity. And then, of course, I went to OED, and it's the first usage of the phrase watchdogs. And you search on Ebo, there's nothing earlier. So actually, it is a piece of linguistic creativity. Yeah, so that was interesting.
Fantastic. So I was going to ask Stephen Fallon if you'd already answered his question, because you expanded on those original ones so much, and I see that he's written my questions already answered. So thank you for that very, very full answer. I've got a question about handwriting and dating, and I hope that the questioner doesn't mind me expanding a little bit. Arnie Pearlstein has a particular interest in Milton, Romeo and Juliet, and is asking, what does your reading of Milton's handwriting indicate about when in Milton's life he wrote his Romeo and Juliet annotations? I know you touched on this, that there's a possibility that these are being made over a long time. I mean, where are we at in handwriting studies, you know, in terms of dating things to particular years in people's lives? I mean, how confident do you feel about that matter, and how are you thinking of taking that?
Well, as I said, I think at the moment my sense of the kind of post 1639 Milton hand is that we don't really have a very clear typology of its development. So he has a kind of, you know, there are you know, there's clearly a very sort of neat early hand in the Commonplace book, and then clearly things are loosening up in the 1640s, and it's possible that one could come up with a sense of how it's loosening. And then I think maybe some of the markings, you know, there are resemblances between the way that he changes some of the speech headings in Romeo and Juliet and some of the, I think, the kind of looser bits of writing in the Commonplace book. But I think you're still going to end up with something quite vague, like it's going to be kind of, you know, early to mid 1640s or something like that. It's not going to be, I think I can't at the moment see a way of getting a very precise fix on the hand. And I think it's the same thing as well. Actually, it's the same with the pre-1630 hand. We sort of know that there's this watershed date, 1638 to 9, but actually nobody quite knows when he starts writing in the Commonplace book, or even I think in the Trinity manuscript, the dating of a lot of items is ambiguous, and the ordering of the pages is ambiguous, and so there's a lot of uncertainty around all of that.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. I have a question. I've written down anon, but I think this is Andy Macmillan. Do you think that the annotations which are yet to be explained on Macbeth are indicative of Milton's progressive knowledge of etymology? I wonder if any of the highlighted words have etymological roots that can be explored, especially with the marginal interventions between the quartos.
This is in Macbeth, and presumably also in the
presumably also,
and Hamlet. Yeah, okay.
Also elsewhere.
Do you think that etymological things going on, Claire? Things about particular words?
I haven't tracked that. I mean, the Cini annotation in Macbeth is quite interesting. CYME is, when you look it up in the OED, it's the only instance of that. The word spelt that way, and in lexicons of early modern English, it doesn't come up. So we've kind of been looking at where does Milton get the SENIE spelling. It is in Purchas, right? Is SENIE? It shows up there. I mean, SENNA is the typical or most common spelling throughout the period. So yeah, this is maybe an avenue that we should think about, because I mean, going back to Emma's question, is like, well, what's the principle of selection, especially in the emendations or provisional emendations, right? If there's so many of these variants that he's not engaging with, why does he engage with the ones that he does. And they seem to be in Romeo and Juliet. They're kind of like clustered in longer speeches. So like Friar Lawrence's speech, Juliet's soliloquy before her wedding night. But sort of thinking a little bit more about the principles of selection there, as Jason's been thinking about the principles of selection for the bracketed passages. But and etymology might be one rubric we could apply and kind of see if that fits. So I think it's a really interesting suggestion.
I suppose Jason's already pointing to that in the answer to the last question, where there's an interest in neologism. That's clearly related to interest in the technicalities of languages that's been used over time.
Yes, and I think there's something. This also applies to some of the Greek texts as well, as sort of like a question about if he's just amending, how much are there moments where, it's really significant what he's choosing to amend. So I think that Milton's got a weird obsession with kind of dawn and twilight and kind of, he has an obsession with chronology. Generally, the writing of time, generally, every single, rising of the sun or kind of, the sky looking loweringly or whatever in Shakespeare gets marked. And that was really striking when I started off looking at this book. The thing that really, weirded me out was that he marks every kind of notation of the time of day, and then you go back to the early poems and you go back to L'Allegro and Penseroso, and it's this kind of walk through the day, and you kind of go from dawn till dusk and then through the night and back to the next dawn, and so that was really striking. And then some of the Greek texts, he will sort of pick out and amend a word, and it will just happen to be about twilight or the dawn. So you think, oh, there's that obsession again. And so the question, I suppose, is how much the emendations point to the obsessions. And quite often he's amending passages where he's also marking in the margins. So it's a passage that he seems to value, but then quite a lot of the time as well, he'll sort of seem to be asleep. There'll be no markings in a play like, I don't know, Merry Wives, say, and then you'll suddenly get a little kind of clutch of emendations. So you think, oh, wow, he's still here. So that's something we haven't quite.
That's so what you're saying about mornings and evenings is so fascinating, because it ties in with Milton being so obsessed with being the first or being really late. The morning of Christ's nativity, I got there before the three kings got there.
Absolutely.
So it's a real interesting. His character is affected so much, or what we might detect of his character.
Yeah.
I've got two fun questions coming up. All the questions have been fun, but I think you'll like these two. I think you'll have fun with these ones. Lydia Atkins, if 9 books are known to have passed through Milton's hands, which ones are we missing? Which would you like to discover next? And what other gaps are missing?
So I've done a little work on trying to look at all the Shakespeare quartos, thanks to Zach Lesser and Adam Hooks's new Shakespeare census. We kind of have a sense of where all the copies are that survive or that we know survive. So I've been hoping that maybe we'll find his copy of Romeo and Juliet or Hamlet. I've been thinking a bit about the Purchas's Pilgrims, but I don't think, Jason, you mentioned the Boswell.
I flew past it. I did.
You did briefly mention it. Yeah. So someone tried to reconstruct Milton's library, Jackson Boswell, in 1975. It's a really, really interesting project, sort of drawing on all the allusions and quotations and citations that Milton uses throughout his own writings, and obviously the Commonplace book becomes an important source there. But the only Jason was saying that Richard III is the only play text that Boswell says Milton definitely read. The First Folio is dubious. It's marked as dubious. So yeah, I'd love to find some, as a early modern drama person, I'd love to find some more dramatic texts that he read. Obviously Euripides is an important touchstone for this project, but it would be nice to find some more vernacular texts. Other than the Bible, this is the first vernacular text that we know him, or we're fairly confident that he owned and read. But Jason might have different answers to this.
Well, so Will Pool's new edition of the Commonplace book has this sort of enormous list of all the books that he cites, and I think they're basically all missing. And he didn't necessarily own all of them. He could well have been drawing on any number of libraries, Oxford, Eton, Sion College, like just lots and lots of possibilities, Kidderminster Library, lots of different possibilities. But he does seem to have owned some of them, because because Paul postulates this model. He's making these marks in the margins, and he's going through and scooping them up again into the commonplace book. So we have this list of just hundreds of books that he owned. I don't know whether do we want to find those books. I mean, it'd be nice to find those books to sort of see what's going on. And it does seem slightly delinquent that we've lost them in the to the dunghill women. I guess, but it would be nice to find. Yeah, I think if we could find other dramatic quartos, that would be really interesting. And obviously, other vernacular, other English literature would just be really interesting to sort of be able to, to sort of see whether the patterns that are coming. Because I think it's a big surprise that he treats his Shakespeare in this way. It's one of the big surprises that he's kind of doing this philological work with the Shakespeare. And so, is he doing that with Spenser too? You'd have to guess that he probably is. And there are a whole load of, then where do you stop in kind of wishing for juicy finds? Yeah.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you. And then Hesselise Jeffries asks, is there any suggestion, especially in the Tempest brackets, that he's noting syntax and or versification?
Oh, yeah, interesting. Shall I try that? I kind of zoomed through the Tempest this afternoon in status. So syntax and versification. He's very obsessive about songs and about inset poems. So he's just generally kind of, if his pen is asleep in a text, it will usually come to life again for a song. Or for a poem. That's true in Midsummer Night's Dream, where in Merchant of Venice, the casket scene. He kind of suddenly he's there for the verses in the caskets and for the song that's sung to encourage the right choice. And then Love's Labour's Lost. He's kind of in there for Longueville and Dumain's poem. Strangely, he wakes up for the overhearing scene. He's there. So, and then he's marking, pretty much all the songs unless they're about cuckoldry, in which case he stops thereafter. Even Autolycus. So that sort of suggests a kind of, to me, it's odd because you don't need to mark those songs out because they're already marked out. You can see them because they're there on the page. But it does suggest a sort of, and I guess with the Mariana's song as well, that kind of the copying in of that stanza that suggests a certain kind of engagement with Shakespeare. I think that these you can kind of imagine that through his father and the kind of composing circles and the instrumental circles. And they're probably stealing all these bits of Shakespeare and setting them to music. Syntax. I haven't thought hard about this question, but what I noticed, I was looking at King John today, which is a play that I don't know very well, so I was thinking, what on earth is he doing with King John? And sort of, is there lots of politics in King John? And there is a tiny bit of politics when King John, abjures the Pope or whatever. He does get excited a tiny bit, but not enough, I don't think, for Milton. And what's interesting there was some speeches he marks of Constance's, which are kind of odd. She's coming out with this stream of kind of sorrow and kind of anger, and he marks a couple of lines which are very sort of metrically interesting. So they're just kind of metrically jagged in a certain kind of way. I don't know. It's like kind of, I don't know, what is it? War, no peace. Peace to me is war, or something like that. And he just marks that line, and then he marks another line which is the same kind of form. So I think there's something. The Queen's Lament. He marks bits of it, I think, and he marks the bit where the Queen says that she wants to cuddle death. She wants to kind of cozy up with a skull, and kind of worms and rotting flesh and stuff. So I think there is potentially there. I think he is actually really interested in the shape of utterances and little bits of dialogue where you sort of think that's kind of, what. And sometimes it's because the dialogue, it's just a very elegant way of saying something another way. I think there is a kind of sense of copia there. But I think there might also be, I haven't really thought enough about it metrically, but I think he might be interested in some of the weird metrical things that come out of Shakespeare.
There was a follow-up question from Katie Murphy, which I'll slightly truncate. Sorry, Katie.
Some people do know King John. They're showing off about it.
In your answer, you're saying that there is some kind of formal interest, or there's a potential there for the formal parallel reading. Katie Murphy was asking, for example, given the interest in witches, is there an interest in the 7-syllable line that seems to
totally, I think that's absolutely, you can sort of see the way that feeds into his own writing. I think that would be a really obvious case of that. I'm trying to think if there are other. I can't really think. I mean, actually, one thing that's really struck me is he marks a lot of couplets, just sort of. I mean, because there's a kind of thing about Milton and sententiousness, and actually Paul says in his edition that Milton is a bit dismissive about the kind of culture of sententiousness, and his own practice in the commonplace book is rather unusual because he's not terribly interested in style most of the time. It's kind of very substancy kind of entries in the commonplace book. So and dismissive of rhyme obviously elsewhere, yes. But actually it's quite interesting. He marks a lot of Shakespeare's little kind of rhymed moments and kind of things like he whom the sword of heaven will bear in Measure for Measure. So kind of there's something, maybe this is just because it's, I don't know, it's not, I mean, it's weird. How do we reconcile this with the question of is this early Milton or, I mean, I don't know, yeah.
Okay, so I have a plan here, which is, given that the cats are now present,
sorry,
we've also reached 5:30. There are 3 more questions I'd like to fit in. Do you have time for that? 2 of them are quite short.
Yeah.
Sure.
So Amrita Dar asks, we're going back to the text here with two quite short questions, quite specific questions. One is, does the folio have writing by any of Milton's amanuenses, as far as you're aware? And then the other one from Gordon Campbell, the matching letters that you show are convincing. When you've been going through the rest of the alphabet, did you find any letters that were particularly discrepant that gave you pause for thought?
Amanuenses, I don't think we have. Have we spotted anything that looks amanuensis-like?
There are 4 interventions in the folio that don't fit either the prologue hand or this other hand. There are 3 very small corrections.
I can try to show these, actually.
Yeah, and then the one of the running titles, I think it's Two Gentlemen of Verona, is, so Merry Wives of Windsor is corrected to Two Gentlemen of Verona. So
these are hands which probably aren't Milton. There's someone else, but we don't know who.
Yeah. But other than that, there's no. The answer to the question is no.
Okay.
So no amanuenses and forms of letter forms that don't stack up. I think it all looks pretty. I mean, I think so one thing is that you don't because apart from the Romeo and Juliet prologue, actually there aren't lots and lots of words in this book. There's the just the bits that we've shown you. That's all the text in the book, apart from little kind of odd emendations, a letter here, a letter there, a deletion. There's not actually all that much writing, so it's quite a lot of letter forms are not documented in the folio, so you can't compare. That also limits your ability to sort of date, because you just can't compare. You can't sort of say, let's look at all his capital Fs or whatever and compare them. You just don't have any. You don't have. You may have one. So it limits the amount of cross comparison you can do. But the letter forms actually are kind of all. You can match them up with stuff that's in his other manuscripts really happily. There's a misprint in Hamlet where they misprint. They have pelican instead of politician, and he writes in politician with this kind of big baggy P, sort of really blousy sort of P, and that's all over the commonplace book. I mean, there's a lot where you sort of look at the letter forms and you think, this is reinforcing my confidence.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so this will be the last question then, from Megan Heffernan. The temporality of reading is fascinating. I am, surprise, surprise, so struck by the Surrey Tottle reference, which has to predate 1587. Shakespeare elsewhere mocks songs and sonnets for being outdated. Does Milton elsewhere pick up on any of these kinds of old sources, these kind of critiques? Does he acknowledge the history he's accessing, partaking in?
That's so interesting.
Great
I don't know. I don't know. But another thing to definitely follow up on. Do you know, Jason? You've sort of studied the passages that have been marked a little bit more closely than I have.
That's a brilliant observation. I guess. So it's really interesting that he knows where that Hamlet Gravedigger song comes from, and that was one of the things that Lee kind of says. This is just kind of extraordinary that sort of before, I don't know, a century before the editors get hold of this, someone has noticed that there is this source for that song, and I suppose. And it does, and I have not had a chance to go back through Tottle and kind of think, is Milton absolutely steeped in Tottle, which would be quite a surprise, I suppose, or it might seem like a weird new thing. I guess I wonder whether it's happening through song settings, so that, given that he's so immersed in singing, I wonder whether that would be a way in which that old text is, Lord Vaux's poem is still being recycled. Or maybe just everyone is still reading Tottle, and everyone still knows all of the stuff in Tottle, into the 1630s and 40s. No, it's really interesting. I don't know. I suppose it does. Looking at Milton's other, the other books that he owned, you're sort of aware of the immense historical vistas that he must have inhabited. So, I don't know, like yesterday I was, thanks to a colleague, Tanya Demetriou, I was starting to kind of crack into the things that were going on in his Heraclides commentary on Homer's allegory. And it's like kind of this extraordinary, Heraclides writing, I don't know, what is he? No, I think nobody knows when exactly he is. Maybe a contemporary of Plato, writing about Homer, in offering all these kind of pseudo-rationalistic explanations of Homer's allegory and why he's chosen this deity to represent this particular thing. So he's inhabiting these vast kind of temporal expanses, and I guess the Commonplace Book shows he's also reading Chaucer. So I don't know. Perhaps I haven't thought. I mean, that will need a lot more thinking about, I think, and why the Tottle is there. Yeah.
Well, in a sense, that's a great note to end on, because it's opening out towards the many questions that your research is raising. So that's fantastic. Thanks so much for all the amazing information you've given us, the brilliant presentation, really, really fascinating material. I wanted to finish with a quote from the comment box, which says, "Brilliant, the discovery of the century, and a beautiful collaboration." And I think that's absolutely true. So I'm going to ask you both maybe one more favor before we end, two more favors. The chat is going to stay open for half an hour. I think our videos are now going to stop soon. But maybe there are a few more questions in the Ask a Question box. Maybe you could answer some of those via text.
Sure. Yeah.
Sure.
And Claire, also, it was great to meet your cats. There was a lot of appreciation for them. And if they are still around, here we go.
Yay.
Hold on. This is Viola. Say hi. Hi.
Hello, Viola.
And this is Sebastian.
Oh, wow. They're a little bit distinguishable, aren't they?
Yeah, not quite twins.
So thank you again so much, and thanks to everyone for coming. It was amazing to see so many people come out. Not at all surprising, given how brilliant this project is. So thanks once again to everyone, and I hope you have a great evening and rest of week. And our speakers will answer a few more questions in the comment box.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Thank you.